Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining APQC's Financial Management webinar, How to Avoid Immature Forms of Driver-Based Financial Performance Planning. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We will be live tweeting this webinar, so you can follow along with us using the hashtag FMAPQC. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them using the question tab on the right side of your screen. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And today's webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of the slides and recording within the next few days. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's moderator, Mary Driscoll. Mary is an author, editor, and lecturer with expertise in corporate finance, capital markets, and business management. Mary serves as Senior Research Fellow at APQC and leads the Financial Management Research Initiative. So now, without any further ado, I will turn it over to you, Mary.
Thanks for that, Sarah. And as Sarah said, good morning and good afternoon. Before I introduce today's presenter, I just want to tee up the topic. I'll just take 30 seconds to do this. I worked with our presenter on kind of shaping this. He's the expert, I must say. But the title is rather controversial. I think, how to avoid immature forms of driver-based financial performance planning. Because we've heard so much in the last, say, 3 to 5 years about the benefits of driver-based planning. And of course, theoretically, that is so true. But companies have a hard time getting up the maturity curve of that. So I've asked Dean Sorensen today to come and help tease apart, unpack this problem. So kind of the backdrop is that, you know, the internet is awash with alluring visions of dynamic and integrated financial planning and performance management. And you hear a lot from software vendors, you know, who talk about how their own solutions can enable forward thinking by FP&A executives. The trick has to do with corporate complexity, organizational complexity. And as that grows, the cracks in this picture are exposed. And the hypothesis today is that organizations never fully integrate strategy, finance, and operations. And the result, unfortunately, is in immature forms of driver-based planning, rolling forecasts, and scenario planning. And APQC certainly knows from its own research that those things are true. Today's presenter is Dean Sorensen, a regular APQC guest commentator, and he is a founder of a consulting firm called IBP Collaborative. He brings a unique mix of strategic, financial, and operational experience to questions that currently vex finance leaders. Today, he's going to touch on several myths, and you will learn about, number one, 4 capabilities that are critical for mature processes, technology innovations that support these capabilities. He'll explore why these capabilities are critical for complex organizations, and he'll look at prescriptive analytics that enable these capabilities. So enough from me. I now hand the present.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks everybody for joining today. That was a great introduction, Mary. I appreciate that. Just to build on what you said, one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is my experience with some companies, and I'm going to walk through a case that involves this, of companies what I call hitting the wall. And, you know, these are companies that have had some experience with various forms of financial planning and performance management or leading practices and aren't getting what they want out of it. So you see on the screen here, rolling forecast, driver-based planning, strategy execution, profit and cost management. As well, many are interested in integrating or unifying planning, but the problem is I think they're still a little bit confused about it. And the other part of it is that there's a lot being talked about in terms of finance as a business partner. So how does all this really kind of come together? So in terms of how we're going to explore this, what I want to first do is kind of give you a quick overview of prescriptive analytics. I'm not going to do a deep dive, but just to kind of give you an idea of what it entails. then like to introduce a case study which relates to a company I've been working with, and as well probably really reflects conversations I've had with many companies over the past few years. And then when I get into sections 4, 5, and 6, I'm going to talk about some very specific capabilities that organizations are having difficulty with. I want to tie that back to finance as a business partner in terms of what it means to how you want to develop capabilities internally, and then we can have some time for questions. So with that, I want to first introduce the idea of prescriptive analytics. And this week, I'm going to publish a couple articles on planning and performance management, especially as it relates to strategic CPM and why organizations are having difficulty with planning. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about relates to the manufacturing sector, primarily because a lot of companies are really starting to experience this now, but I'll relate it to other sectors as well, because I think a lot of other sectors are experiencing the same thing. So I'm going to go through here. There's a few detailed slides. I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail because they're included in these articles. So the first one, you hear a lot of companies talking about advanced analytics, and it's really comprised of 3 components, as you see on the left-hand side. So descriptive being, dashboards is a classic example of descriptive analytics and drilling into detail. Predictive, classic one would be statistical forecasting, and the last one's prescriptive, which is where I want to focus. And prescriptive analytics, for the lack of a better term, is just highly advanced modeling. One of the reasons why I know a fair amount about prescriptive analytics is because I used to work for a software company that made it, and was probably one of the most sophisticated planning tools I've ever seen. But one of the things is that whenever I talk to companies that do prescriptive analytics, they all have kind of case studies where they've literally saved companies hundreds of millions of dollars. And the reason why they do this is because if you look at the way companies plan their business these days, much of it is still highly siloed, focused on individual functions. There's very little cross-functional planning. And because of that, where the value comes is companies tend to over and undercompensate for risk because they don't have the sophisticated planning tools. So just to kind of get a little bit more binary about what kind of logic, there's some capabilities on here which I call kind of foundational modeling logic, like multiple calendars, time-based models. You can read about this in the article, but those are sort of the basic things. In the article, you'll see this particular graphic. I think that what I want to focus on is the ones on the bottom. All right, and there's some things that prescriptive analytics does that traditional strategic CPM tools don't do, which includes like driver rules. So for example, what happens when I hit a capacity constraint? What rules should I apply? Or dynamic drivers, which mean, how do I translate upstream volumes into downstream volumes? And how do I plan both from a functional and a business process perspective? So there's some very specific things that prescriptive analytics does that strategic CPM tools, for the most part, don't do. And, I put this slide in because, I hear a lot of strategic CPM tools companies talking about prescriptive analytics, especially as it relates to improving forecasting. But, if you look back over the years, I think traditional thinking, a line of thinking, would say that, you can only get forecasts so accurate. And at some point in time, what you really want is something that can allow you to figure out, how can I react if the forecast changes? And that really is how do you translate demand into strategic financial and operational plans. And that's a big part of what we're doing. So, it's nice to have all these great predictive tools, but you need prescriptive ones to go along with it in complex organizations to really make full use of it. So with that was just sort of a foundation on prescriptive analytics. And, the key takeaway is that these tools do things that most, virtually all financial planning tools do. In fact, one of the things is that when I look at strategic CPM tools, very few are even thinking along the lines of prescriptive analytics. And this is really sort of a lead into this case study I wanted to talk to you about. So this case study relates to a large manufacturer who had been using like a strategic CPM tool. They've been an early adopter. I think they were using it for around 10 years. They were an early adopter of sales and operation planning. And one of the things that they realized, they were using a tool that was based on some of the earlier tools that were based on multidimensional tools, cube-based planning, and they had come to the conclusion, like a lot of companies are coming to, that these sorts of tools just aren't really made for complex planning. And they went out and they were hearing all the hoopla around a lot of these tools are up on the cloud now, so they thought they would go towards the cloud. And what they ended up finding was that those tools weren't much better in the way of planning. That mean that they had a lot of the same constraints, different ones, but constraints nonetheless. So this is what he articulated to me. Like, we put together this slide, and a lot of the things on the left-hand side are things I've already talked about in terms of challenges that companies are facing. But probably one of the ones that he focused on was about scenario planning. And what he was looking for was a tool that could go from demand planning, both from a financial and operational perspective, through to cash flow across multiple legal entities. And he said this was a major problem, and it's a major problem for a lot of companies, actually. But at the same time, one of the things he wanted to try and get away from was the complexity of the solution. So, some of these older tools, like these, the ones that he was using, it took a fair amount of time to get people up to speed on how to use them. And whenever you wanted to make a change, it took forever. You became really dependent on key individuals and especially consultants. They had consultants coming in on an ongoing basis. And the time and cost to implement upgrade solutions was it was horrendous. So he had really kind of had enough of it. And, probably one of the biggest things that he had was, questions that he had was, I'm looking around for alternatives. And, when I look at industry analysts, what's confusing to me is that they're already telling me I'm using the leading tool. So he's sitting there thinking, how could this possibly be true? Because, this has to be one of the most cumbersome processes that I'm currently looking at. And this was the question that we started talking about. And when I said, I take a kind of a different view of the market. So if you look at just purely from a plan, two dimensions of the problem, just planning and performance management. In fact, what you'll find is that a lot of the tools, the financial planning tools, I find are really not all that sophisticated. They're still fairly, I think they're pretty immature. And the two dimensions I've talked about here is profit and strategy alignment and resource quantification. And if it's not that these market evaluations are incorrect. I think that for a lot of companies, if you're a small company and you're just looking for a generic financial application, and your needs aren't all that complicated, then it's probably a good representation of what's available out there. But if you're looking to have a more broader management process that's industry specific, that can support complex organizations, I think that it's really not providing all the information that you need. As well, I think that one of the things I'm going to be talking about are evolutions of technology, and some of the ones that I've looked at. Any company I've seen that really really impressed me, that provided something fundamentally different that I was seeing in the marketplace. Every one of these companies is less than 5 years old. So something happened. I mean, I'm not the technology expert, but something happened within the last 5 years from a technology perspective that just really fundamentally altered the marketplace. So, for example, a lot of the ones that I've seen are just, every single one of them was built on a relational platform. Every single one of them has unlimited dimensions, these sorts of things. And I'm not sure why this happened, but these are some of the common characteristics. So what I see, I mean, a lot of companies are kind of stuck. Their current state, I would say, is that this level of maturity, like a 2 on a scale of 5. And by the way, I'm going to explain what these scales mean in a couple minutes. And that, from this company's perspective, they implemented this new tool, this web-based tool, and it really wasn't that much more mature than the one they had. In fact, I think that probably one of the most mature strategic CPM tools I've seen is really represented here. But interestingly enough, when people talk about who's kind of making some of the most innovative changes in the strategic CPM space, I think it's actually happening in supply chain companies. And what most strategic CPM tools vendors don't realize is that a lot of a number of the vendors in the supply chain space are encroaching on their territory. In fact, I've seen one where some of the capabilities they have are just every bit as good as the ones that the financial tools have. So it's an interesting innovation, but what this really kind of defines is the gap between where companies are now and what's currently available in the marketplace. And what's really new and what's the thing I think that's really innovative is the fact that, if you look at prescriptive analytics tools that are denoted at the bottom there, that, there are different types of prescriptive analytics tools in terms of how mature they are, but some of the most mature ones, and, the tools that I've looked at that are the most innovative, are embedding prescriptive analytics into processes. And, having worked for a prescriptive analytics software company, one of the biggest challenges that we would have is we'd go in there, find a whole bunch of really interesting insight, create a lot of value, and walk away, but we couldn't support any processes. And prescriptive analytics is not new. It's been around for a while. What's new is the ability to embed it into processes, and that's the thing I think is really probably the most exciting and most interesting thing I've seen in the last little while that's really driving innovation. So probably one place I think is probably most recognizable is that if you look at a lot of strategic CPM tools, and I'm going to focus this on manufacturing because they're related to this particular company. Most of these tools just simply were not made for doing things like cash flow forecasting. Just that they support some of the most simplistic forms of cash flow forecasting, because in the manufacturing sector, if you don't know the flow of goods in the manufacturing sector, 9 times out of 10 you're going to get cash flow wrong, and you're going to spend a pile of time trying to do it. And if you look at cash flow forecasting, it has to be one of the most underdeveloped processes in most companies, and it's really the one that's really begging the most for prescriptive analytics in larger companies. Same thing with foreign currency exposure forecasting, tax planning. Strategic CPM tools just weren't made for this kind of complexity. And likewise with cost management. So one of the things, this really kind of sets up, and as I was talking to this particular client, I said, look, I could give you a list of dozens of things that you really need to do, or in some of the capability gaps, but let's just break it down to 4 things so that we really understand. So under resource quantification, there's 2 things that 2 critical capability gaps that companies have. One is that their scenario planning models just don't work. They're just far too simplistic. And the next one is what I call connected outcomes and trade-offs. Like, how do you actually take what you're trying to achieve and drive it into both financial and operational plans? Probably another area where it's very poorly developed. The next area is what I call profit and strategy alignment. So first one being there, how do you actually drive cross-functional alignment? So I think that most larger companies are trying to drive some form of that, but how do you actually entrench it into a solution? And the last one being concurrent processes. Like, how do you turn around a process really quick while simultaneously providing greater insight? So those are the 4 challenges that I see that companies have. And I'm going to walk through and kind of give you an overview of this, but I have a YouTube channel, and you can look it up for yourself, but it goes into detail on each one of these things, plus it provides a high-level overview of why my perspectives on it. It also provides a more detailed understanding of the maturity model I'm about to talk to you about. So if you want more detail, you can look at that. I'm going to focus on the first three just because of time constraints. So with that, I want to get into integrated scenarios, and I want to describe what do you mean by an integrated scenario. So this is a maturity model that I put together. It's the same one you'll find in the video, but if you look, and it's actually a five stages with two versions of the middle one. But I basically break it down into, if you look where most strategic CPM and sales and operations planning tools are, I put them on the left-hand side, and that really describes kind of what they're doing. On the other end of the spectrum are platforms with embedded analytics and prescriptive analytics, and in the middle are some of newer tools provide the ability to develop custom logic, or with more platforms that are actually better for developing a planning system, but they don't have embedded logic in them. Let me just quickly describe what these are. So, for example, if you look at most strategic CPM tools, when you hear them talking about driver-based planning, it's usually rate, number of units times time per unit times unit cost, just some fairly basic things. They usually chart of accounts focused. Likewise, sales and operations planning have their operational planning with some financial planning. They usually do some sort of demand planning, and a big thing what the marketing people are describing these tools as is integrated planning, and this is really what they're describing. Connected models, I think that when you have a platform that can support a number of different dimensions, you can start doing things like integrating supply planning and activity-based planning, but really at a fairly simplistic level. Once you get into tools that support embedded logic, like manufacturing logic, you can see at the bottom here, like bills of materials and routings. Some tools have that kind of capability. And this is, at this stage, this is where you start seeing integration of rolling forecasts and sales and operations planning. And the key distinction here in the middle is that financial and operational applications are using the same models and processes. That's the distinguishing feature. It's not two applications trying to support one process. So, like in smaller organizations that may work, but I think what organizations are finding is that you try to make a process work across multiple applications, it's not as good. And then you get at the other side where you have using prescriptive analytics, you have dynamic drivers, rule-based drivers, the one we talked about before, and then at the end, enterprise optimization, being able to take all those things and optimize investment portfolios as well as your financial and operational plans simultaneously. So one of the things that I just wanted to reiterate here, that in terms of manufacturing, the manufacturing logic has a big impact on treasury, and I have a YouTube video that actually describes this and goes through a numerical example as to why this is. But the main point here is that if you look at where most organizations are at, they're somewhere around a 2. And this is why they're having the challenges that they're having. And this is what I said to this organization that I was talking to. In fact, this was I failed to mention this. This was the VP of FP&A, and as I was talking through this, I explained this is why you're having the challenges that you're having. That the tool that you have just really doesn't have the sort of planning capability that you need. So again, there's a YouTube video that explains that the need for manufacturing logic. So with that, one of the things we thought we'd do is find out where you're at in terms of your the maturity of your scenario planning models. So when Mary brings up the selection, given that I had 6 items, you'll see that there's only 5. I think there's only 5, but it starts off at the second one. maybe you can advance it, Mary or Sarah.
Sarah, as Sarah brings up the actual polling questions with the options, I just wanted to mention if there are any consultants on the line, please feel free to answer on behalf of certain clients you might have in mind. And here we go. How would you characterize the maturity of scenario planning models in your organization? And we'll just leave this open for about 20 seconds. Please select one, either functionally integrated, connected models, embedded logic, business simulation, enterprise optimization. So we'll
these are the terms. These are the terms that I used in the maturity model.
With the, that's right, with the definitions. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see what we have for answers. Yep, Dean, you were right. 50% describe what they have as functionally integrated, and quite interesting. Let's move on. Yeah.
So with that, let's talk about cross-functional alignment. So again, one of the webinars I did last time was finance as a driver of operational excellence, and I spent a fair amount of time on these two slides. But one of the things I talked about were kind of two ideas, one of which was matrix planning, being the ability to simultaneously plan and manage from both a functional and business process perspective. And then the second component was the ability to utilize that information. Before I leave that one of the key capabilities is the ability to always reconcile financial or chart of accounts views of spending and your performance with business process views, and that's what this left-hand side is showing. But then be able to build on that and to bring together the right-hand side really and focus people on outcomes. So in the case of an order fulfillment process, you want your planning and forecasting process focused on, say, for example, $10 an order, X days in receivable, 90% perfect order fulfillment. You want your rolling forecast to be able to drive that, and your actuals to be able to drive something like this. And like I say, I spent a fair amount of time on that one. So if you want to go back and listen to what the details of that, you can. But what I wanted to show here was that in terms of a maturity model, matrix management, I think, is kind of like a stage 3 kind of capability. So you're always reconciling financial and business process costs with your financials. These processes are executed across functions and entities. So one of the challenges that I mentioned to this client of mine was that his process flows were basically functional roll-ups. What you want to be able to do is have the ability to execute processes across any dimension, across multiple legal entities, and while simultaneously enabling that process with alerts and issue management around process outcomes. And then trade-off management is just the next step forward, where you're integrating things like all your performance measures. So if you look in a lot of companies or a lot of systems, the assumptions are stuck in spreadsheets somewhere, the measurement system somewhere else. In this case, these assumptions become metrics in your performance measurement system, and any assumptions are explicitly exposed. And at the other end of the spectrum, like if you look at where do you go at stage 5 is where you shift from functionally based processes and to more horizontal processes where governance and rewards are more horizontally driven. You incorporated project and portfolio management, and you're focused on lifetime product portfolio value as well as customer portfolio value. And where companies are now, what they have is readily available information, functionally driven charts of accounts, but their business process information is sitting in some separate system, and it's not reconciled to the financials, and they're sitting with multiple process frameworks, usually. So with that, let's get a sense for where you're at.
Okay, great. Sarah's going to put up the actual question itself. What we're looking at here is, how would you characterize the maturity of cross-functional alignment in your organization? Please select one. Ad hoc and simple, formalized capabilities, matrix management, trade-off management, or governed portfolios. So we'll give people about 6 more seconds to make a selection. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see what we have, Sarah. Yep, once again.
Yeah. So this is very, very consistent with the clients I've been talking to. Most of them are sitting at, a lot of them are sitting at stage 2. Especially ones that have already implemented strategic CPM tools. So let's move along. So the next thing I want to do is kind of talk about connected outcomes and trade-offs. And again, in one of the other presentations that I did for Mary, I got into a fair amount of detail on this one. I don't want to really reiterate or go through it all. But essentially, one of the things you really want to be able to do is say, you want to take what do you want to achieve and determine what resources are required to achieve it. And, the things that we want to achieve, I want to achieve a certain sales growth, I want to achieve a certain, profit margin, I want to achieve a certain service levels, and be able to translate that down through, what are you trying to provide to your customer, what kind of value proposition do you have, what products do you have, drive that down through your processes and then into a budget. And one of the things, in order to do that, you really need to expose like the key assumptions, like some of the assumptions would be productivity, quality, mix, service level. And then, as you move in, as you introduce a balanced scorecard, one of the things you want to do is overlay that balanced scorecard on top of this framework and then drive it into projects, So the idea being that, if you had a really mature rolling forecast, you should really be able to do this very quickly. Be able to determine, given the volume that I have, what resources do I have, and what changes am I trying to introduce into the company, and then how do I drive that down to the individual and team and process level. So if you look at, really where the maturity model for this, again, the company I was dealing with, they were sort of at stage 2. They'd implemented a balanced scorecard. They've done project and portfolio management. They'd done Lean and Six Sigma, but these things were really never connected. Like the balanced scorecard, really one of the things that companies find is that their balanced scorecard is really only connected to the budget or the financials really once a year. So as things change, the connection between the scorecard and the budgets become loose, and in fact, in a lot of cases, the connections were actually loose to begin with. So as you start moving along the maturity curve, one of the things you want to be able to do is take your operational metrics, your volume, demand, like I call it keep the lights on. How do you translate that all down to financial and operational plans while simultaneously exposing the assumptions. Stage 4 is where you overlay on top of that, deployed strategy, how you integrate balanced scorecard into the process. And then at the very end, how do you do that with your project, customer, and product portfolios while simultaneously looking at the value of those things? So, in each of these cases where I'm looking at these maturity models, the client I'm working with was looking for something more mature that I'd shown here. So, of course, in order to do this, I think in smaller organizations, I think you don't necessarily have to have a single platform. But the more complex you get, it becomes virtually impossible to try and do this across multiple applications. There's just too many moving and interconnected parts. So a big part of what stage you're at, it really depends on the platform. So if you're a big complex company, you've got multiple applications, chances are you're not going to be able to support mature processes that can bring all this together. So this is the third question. But that relates to this maturity model.
Sarah brings up the questions. Here we go. How would you characterize the maturity of connecting outcomes and trade-offs in your organization? So we'll give everybody about 12 seconds to think about this and select an answer. Ad hoc and simple, foundational structures, connected assumptions, deployed strategy, or integrated portfolios. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see what we've got.
Yeah, we've got some forward thinkers in the company on the line who are starting to get into connected assumptions. But a lot of companies are like I say, the major one here is the foundational structures. They're really kind of many companies are stuck like the company I was talking about. So it's very interesting. So what I'd like to do now is really step back and talk to you about, what was it what kind of conclusions did we come to with this one company I've been talking to throughout this webinar. So first off, one of the things that he told me was that, more was being expected of the finance function to drive cost reduction in the organization. And one of the things I told him was that, look, one of the things that your company is doing, you're trying to drive an operational excellence program. One of the things that we all know as finance people is that if you provide information that doesn't reconcile to the general ledger or your budget, the one thing that is for sure going to happen is that nobody's going to believe it. And that's one of the biggest problems with operational excellence programs and cross-functional programs is that you've got this general ledger over here, you've got the budget over here, and you've got process costs floating around that aren't really connected, aren't always connected. So, one of the foundational things, if you're trying to drive cost reduction, one of the things that you got to have is that I talked about earlier, is like providing accurate process costs in the form of matrix planning. That's got to be on your radar screen because you've got to provide information that people actually believe. The second thing is eliminating functional silos. So, while accurate process cost was important, one of the things you've got to support is cross-functional governance, and you can't do that without these trade-offs that I define. You've got to be able to define both the process cost, like what are you trying to, what your target spending is, and connect it to, the targets you're trying to achieve. So the next thing that they were trying to do is shape and execute strategy. So one of the biggest challenges they had was that they couldn't connect their targets to resource consumption, especially during the course of scenario planning. So I want to look at different options in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and I want to do this across whatever 10 or 20 legal entities. I want to do it globally. You've got to have a process that's sitting on top of it. You can't be constrained by scenario planning that's a functionally driven. It's got to integrate finance and operations. So that leads into providing insight. Your models have got to be more operationally realistic. I think that you're running into a brick wall with these strategic CPM tools, these cube-based planning tools, these older tools just aren't cut it to do this sort of scenario planning. So yeah, maybe you can look at what's the impact of an exchange rate change, but if you want to figure out, well, what's the impact of, a change in mix combined with the fact that we might be adding or losing a major customer, combined with the fact that we may be rolling in a new product, that just gets way too complicated. And I think that if you look at a lot of the financial tools, just really aren't up to snuff. And the last thing I talked to him about was the ability to react to change. And one of the things is that you need a rolling forecast process that has the sort of capabilities that can cope with that level of complexity. So what I described to him, I said, look, what you've got is on the left-hand side. The reason why you're running into a brick wall is because the tools you have just won't get you there. And what you need is on the top right. And what you need to focus on are these 4 capabilities that we've just talked about. And that those 4 capabilities, ultimately what they allow you to do is to plan, manage, and govern strategic, financial, and operational outcomes across multiple functions, business units, and legal entities. And the reason why that's important, if you look at this slide, you see the common challenge in the middle. Ultimately, what that means is you're not able to cope with complexity. And, I went into this in a fair amount of detail in our last webinar, which was entitled Finance as a Driver of Operational Excellence by More Effective Complexity Management. I'm not going to go into each one of these in detail, but one of the things I'm finding is that, if you look at some research surrounding CEO concerns, managing complexity has to be one of the top concerns of most CEOs, and it's probably one of the least developed capabilities in most strategic CPM tools. And I think that if you're a global company, a complex company, that you really need to recognize the fact that these things are highly interconnected. And I actually wrote about this. If you go to my LinkedIn page, this article is actually already published. It really talked about this issue, and that graphic I just showed you is actually in that article. And why, it outlines why I believe FP&A can improve profits by up to 5% of sales through effective complexity management. And this 5% of sales came from these research studies up here. But as well, one of the things, an article I also wrote is why strategic CPM software could soon be obsolete. And, really I was writing this as it related to big complex companies. Because one of the things I find, the technology is changing so much, and I think that what companies perceive to be leading financial tools, I think that's just really not the case. So actually I'm working on one company right now. If you look at this particular screen, and by the way, this article refers to this graphic as well. One of the things I'm working on right now is a project where if you look at all the various processes and applications on here, we're looking at one single application to support all these things. And this is a manufacturer I'm working with, and as I mentioned to you before, what's happening in the marketplace right now is what happened to ERP 30 years ago has now in fact happened to planning. It's not that it's going to happen, it's already happened. We're actually working with tools that do this stuff. Problem is that they're not, like I said, these are all younger tools, but I'll tell you that what's available in the marketplace is really pretty amazing in terms of what it supports. And interestingly enough, one of the places that we're supporting is master data management. We're using a tool that supports both master data management, and then a couple of processes that aren't in here. We're it's going to support new product development, project and portfolio management, strategic sourcing, and then we're going to integrate it with a rolling forecast. So one of the things, the main thing to understand here is that these tools are for real, and I think they're fundamentally different than what you're going to find in how the market is currently evaluating leading practices in financial management tools. So just a different way of looking at this. So if you look at different ways that people can look at an elephant, they can, if you're only looking at part of the elephant, you can develop different interpretations. And the same is true of, the way that, we're looking at management systems, like we have, the different boxes here. Like a lot of analysts are looking at the market from a siloed perspective, I believe. And one of the reasons for that is that, for the most part, companies are still buying these tools in silos, and I think one of their objectives is to help companies buy tools. But if you're a company who's already been down this path, you've already bought a sales and operations planning system, you've already done activity-based costing, you've already done strategic CPM, you know that these tools aren't everything that you need. You need to step back and start looking at it a little bit differently, and you need to understand what's available in the marketplace. And one of the things I think it's important to understand or kind of rethink is, what do you mean by one version of the truth? So, when I hear software, some of these software companies now are targeting some of the older strategic CPM tools, and they're talking about, we can support one version of the truth, and we can do all these great and wonderful things. One of the things I find is that their support, they can provide you with one source of financial and non-financial data, but that is just a small portion of what you're really looking for. If you're trying to achieve, as a strategic business partner, if you're trying to drive the business, you need to kind of reshape your thinking about what one version of the truth means, because the vast majority of strategic CPM tools, I don't think support this kind of version of the truth. And I think that from a complex company, from a complexity perspective, a lot of companies kind of need to rethink what they mean by this. So with that, let me just tell you that from a key takeaway perspective, I think that, you know, for large companies who are at this stage where, you know, they're kind of rethinking their technology strategy and they're really trying to kind of get over the hump, you really need to identify what your key capability gaps are. And I think hopefully I gave you a few to think about. You really need to understand your technology and alternatives because there's more out there than you think there are, and they're very interesting in terms of their impact on the business, and use a more holistic approach. And we don't really utilize this term, but the technology supporting management processes now currently exist. So you really need to kind of bear that in mind. So I gave you some things today in terms of YouTube videos. I talked about some articles. So if you want to have access to if you want to just reach out, connect with me, and you'll get the updates. You'll see some of the articles. But if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so. And we had one last polling question, which Mary's going to execute as we start taking questions from people.
Okay, here we go. Let's see if we can get one more in here. How would you characterize the complexity of your organization? Very simple, or no signs of complexity, starting to see complexity, somewhat complex, very complex, or highly complex. So we'll give people just about 8 seconds. Yeah,
wow.
That totally jives with a lot of the statistics you put up there, Dean, about from all those different sources of thought leadership. There was one there that mentioned, for instance, I think that it caught my eye where it said most cost reduction efforts, you know, come apart after 3 years. And I think that's true of finance, as particularly that CFOs will go through a process streamlining exercise, various workflow technologies are installed, new people are moved around, new organizational structures, and they benchmark 2 years, 3 years later and find they're back where they started. And I think, you know, just my comment here that it has to do with what the point that you made, that so many companies are still stuck in the foundational or stage 2 or 3 areas of your maturity model, where it depends on, you know, just an army of finance and accounting people having to deal with roll-ups and reconciliations and using spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff. How on earth can a CFO truly get costs down and keep them down when that's your basic approach? So with that, we really don't have any questions popping up right now.
One thing I'll just reiterate, just to build on the one point where you had 70-some-odd% of companies who were highly complex. You know, if you're one of the companies that said you were really complex, and then, you know, if you were at lower stage of maturity, one of the things that I think that you really ought to be thinking about is, you know, stepping back and looking at your systems in totality, because I think that one of the things that you're going to find is that, you know, and actually what I'm doing with this current client is, you know, thinking about how long is it going to take to get to where we really need to be. So I could take what I have and bolt on a bunch of stuff, but I think that especially if you're using some of the older tools, I think what you're going to find is that you're going to, if you haven't found it already, you're going to build something so complex it's going to be unmaintainable. And I think that one of the biggest things as well is what you don't want to do. Like this one client of mine, he said, look, I want to do all this stuff, but I don't want to double my finance staff either. So how do I do all this? Well, simultaneously reducing the cost of my FP&A and making myself more effective. And I think what that requires is some, you know, new capabilities, and especially, you know, if you took anything away from all this, you really need to understand what prescriptive analytics is, why it's different, and why embedding prescriptive analytics into more sophisticated processes is a pretty big deal.
Well said. Well, with that, I think we're going to close out. That was very, very interesting, Dean. And as Sarah said at the earlier, as we got started, people will receive a copy of the recording and the slides. There was an awful lot of material here to digest, but I want to thank Dean for taking the time and really putting in a tremendous amount of energy to pull this together for us. He's one of my favorite thought leaders on this stuff because he's passionate and sincere. So with that, Sarah will close us out.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Dean, for that presentation. I echo Mary's sentiments there. We always appreciate you coming in. Everybody will receive links to the recording of this webinar, as well as a link to the slides, and any other kind of supplemental information that Dean thinks would be good for you guys to have and from APQC as well. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you.